We'll get started, guys. As I mentioned before, we have around 100 plus people joining on the line, but we're very fortunate today to have three great practitioners to discuss our topic, ForcePlate integration into performance sports, and really fortunate to have Dr. John Wagle, who is the current Kansas City Royals Director of Performance Science and Player Development, and has done some great work out of ETSU with some phenomenal coaches, and continues to work with some Olympic athletes as well, working alongside Dr. Brad DeWeese, who, if you're fortunate enough to watch John's presentation that he did for us, I highly recommend it, which he did on some athlete monitoring components in skill-based athletes. And it's a great dive into just some of the differences between less skilled and more skilled, and how you may go at assessing some of the questions that we need to ask in performance sport. We have Paul Tofari, who's a human performance scientist at ACU, and has been really pivotal in some research out of the ACU Melbourne facility, and will provide a great insight into some of the research that's been performed in this area, but also the practical applications. And we have the man himself, Mr. Phil Graham-Smith, who is the head of biomechanics and innovation at Aspire and the co-founder of ForceDecks, that has also been previously consultants to multiple clubs and organisations, and will provide us a really great overview of ForcePlate integration, not only within an applied setting, but also the research setting and some of the work that he's done over the years. So thanks to the three of you guys for joining us, and really looking forward to the discussion we have today. For those of you who haven't seen any of the online series, the way that we're basically pushing out the online series is through these sorts of on-demand presentations and live panels. And we've been really fortunate to put together some great high-performance experts. And today we have the panel discussion, but a few other ones. We have live presentations or live webinars, and the one that I spoke about that John's given is a great one if you haven't seen that already. Those are all available via the on-demand link as seen here. So feel free, if you haven't already registered for that, to log in. There's already about 6 presentations up there that have gone on over the last 2 weeks. So, and we've got a great month coming ahead with some content around Olympic series, the female athlete, and a leadership series as well. As I mentioned, these are the guys that we have today, and we're looking forward to diving into the discussion. So I'll get you guys, if you want to unmute yourselves now, and we can jump straight in. So one of the questions that we were getting from people who work in high performance sport and are looking to use ForcePlates is, over the years, the use of them has increased, and I guess why do we think this has occurred, and is it having a positive impact on our industry, do we believe, and actually giving us better information to identify qualities within our athletes? Phil, I might direct that one to you to start with.
Well, thanks very much, Selwyn. Yeah, right, where do we start with that one? ForcePlate technology. Let's put things in order first. I mean, there's nothing new about ForcePlates. I mean, I was a student back in the late 80s, early 90s in Liverpool, and that's when I was first introduced to ForcePlates. We used them quite extensively in the support we provided to squads, be it football, rugby, athletics. I think the problem was back then was that you had to have bespoke software to analyze force data. And we were using old Acorn systems, and prior to that, Archimedes, and then the PCs came along, and in the end, we ended up using like an Excel spreadsheet to analyze data, and it wasn't as slick, and the transition from collection to analysis wasn't there. So that was a bit of a frustration for myself. And we were looking for solutions all the time to bridge that gap for a seamless collection analysis, which the old systems used to give us. And in that time, I think, you know, there was quite a few teams, clubs, institutes that had ForcePlates, and then they just seemed to go into a cupboard, got locked up. So I think it was really around the software applications that rejuvenated ForcePlates and has really kick-started this new era of exploration, monitoring, and I think it's gone wild. You know, it's great, but sometimes I think it needs to be harnessed in a little bit as well.
Yeah, definitely. I guess sometimes it's, and John's presentation touched on it, is understanding what we want to assess and actually understand the metrics that are important to assess the sport that we need to look at, and kind of what components actually differentiate, I guess, between elite and sub-elite players to a degree. And one of the questions we had around integrating ForcePlates was if we're trying to integrate them in a pre-training testing time with, say, a daily screening battery, what sort of tests would you guys be looking at implementing if we were to, let's use a field sport athlete, for example, if we were to integrate ForcePlates into a daily testing component? John, I might throw to you for this initially.
Yeah, I mean, we actually implement something very similar and lean on ForceDecks quite a bit to help us process and make sense of this data in real time. And we don't do anything probably that's not very surprising. We do an unweighted counter movement jump assessment following their warm up, and gives us a quick snapshot on where they're at for that day. Now in different spots, we've used different tests. Used weighted static jump assessments with like a 20 kilo bar back at the Olympic training site in Johnson City, and done some different things from that standpoint. But given our scope and our volume, with the number of athletes that we have and kind of how busy the athletes' days are, the unweighted counter movement jump does just fine and gives us a ton of very useful information. And
is there particular metrics that you're looking at for that in regards to between athlete change or within athlete change, or are you looking at the squad just as a general overview?
Sure. I've actually learned a ton from people like Daniel Martinez and Dr. Cohen in this space. So, you know, leaning on what they have provided us, you know, both in conversations with them, but also in the research that they have published, has given us some really useful tools. And, you know, again, maybe not even telling anybody something that they don't know, but we lean on RSI modified. The second layer that we might go to is the eccentric duration. And that one I got directly from Dr. Cohen. And so that just gives us, because a lot of times we have to make decisions rather quickly. And so we don't necessarily, it's not practical to look at a ton of variables. So those two are typically the ones that we'll lean on the most in those moments.
Paul, you've done some work with ForcePlates, and obviously Stu Cormack works there at ACU as well. Did you have anything to add to some of those variables?
Yeah, I think my first question, I just had a quick one for John. I was just wondering if any of those variables that you measure pre-training would influence what you do with the guys at training. For example, if there's a variable that gets flagged as being much different than what it was the previous day, would that modify what you do in training that day, or is it something that you just keep in the books to modify training in the future if need be?
I mean, I can give the classic, like, it depends. Like, there's a lot of other context that gets thrown into that when you are making like workload management decisions, obviously. So, and time of year are going to matter as well. Obviously, like during the off season, we're less inclined to modify the workloads, but when we are in a situation and players are accountable to play at a high level every night, then those are the times where we are much more inclined to adjust the workloads.
Yeah. So, just getting back to your question, I think the RSI mod and flight time, contraction time are essentially really similar measurements, and they use quite similar metrics. So a lot of Stu's research and stuff that I've done as well has suggested that flight time, contraction time ratio or RSI mod, I think the relationship I found was like an R squared of 0.95 or something between the two. They both seem to be quite sensitive at an individual level and responsive to match simulations that we've done and to actual team sport performance as well. So it gives you some understanding of some of those jump metrics or some of those underlying components to a jump performance that will give us an indication of whether an athlete's different than what they were on a previous day.
Phil, did you have any other tests or protocols that you feel would be beneficial for field-based athletes?
I mean, the classics things that we started off with, working with the jump squads back in the UK in the early 90s, was the old Bosco-Comey things. You know, you do a profile of your squat jump, which should be purely concentric, your low-level stretch shortening counter movement jump, and then followed by drop jumps 20, 40 centimeters. There's difficulties around protocol, I think, and standardizing squat jumps. So you don't get the head rock can create that dip in the force curve and give some semblance of a counter movement. So, counter movement is your standard, isn't it? I think that's the easiest to perform. You look at your jump height. Jump height is a number one variable regardless for me. It gives you the context of the performance ability on any given day. The next thing is then, how did they perform that? Was it through a slow eccentric phase, deep? What was the velocity of the eccentric phase? What was the force at the zero velocity or onset of concentric phase? For me, if we look at the mechanics of it all, your jump height is basically your net impulse in the concentric phase. And if you can apply less force over longer time above body weight or shorter time, higher force, both will give you the same jump height potentially, but it's what you did prior to that to get your force at a higher level at the onset of concentric phase. So for me, that other variable, force at velocity is zero, is the outcome of how you're loading those tissues with respect to the depth and velocity of your counter movement. So, say what Paul and John have said there, your flight time, contraction time ratios are a great measure, or your eccentric duration relative to concentric and flight time. A great metrics, and you can't really get them off contact mats if you're looking at eccentric concentric duration. So that's where force plates come into their own. One thing I'm not 100% sure of where the RSI modifier came from. It's a strange one for me. The units are meters per second, and in my simple Yorkshire mind from the north of England, that's velocity. So, and if you take in off a jump mat, for example, flight time, to get the jump height, you've got to square the flight time and divide it by 8, GT squared over 8. So you're squaring any error you get in flight time, and at the end of the day, we know flight time relates to jump height anyway. So why contaminate it and just leave it with flight time over movement time? That would be, in my simple thinking, that's where I'd be looking at. And the units are dimensionless. It's essentially saying how much more time can you spend in the air relative to the time spent you created the impulse to get you that high. Simple. But again, you know, each to their own. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just a little, I'm more around the non-modified version.
Yep.
Just on that one, Selwyn, we've some of the research we've done recently, and following on what Phil said about a squat jump, has suggested that the squat jump seems to be reasonably sensitive to post-match changes as well. But we do see probably more repeat trials in relation to getting an accurate squat jump and making sure that we don't breach any thresholds in terms of a small amplitude counter movement prior to the performance of that. And I think on a ForceDecks platform, Phil would know it's about 20 newtons that they need to unload before that jump goes from being a squat jump to a counter movement jump. So that can be an issue with using a test such as that.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, Paul, with setting up that protocol, are you predetermining everyone's squat depth based on knee joint angle, hip joint angle, or are you allowing kind of athlete preferential and then just trying to replicate that each time?
Yeah, it comes up a fair bit actually, especially when you're getting papers reviewed to try and publish them. But we tend to use a self-selected squat depth and plenty of familiarization for the athletes prior to them performing that test. So the familiarization seems to be a key component to getting repeatable performance for them. But we don't try and add further stipulations to forcing them to a certain angle. We get them into a self-selected squat position and make them hold that for about 3 seconds. We do see probably around the 90-degree angle anyway. So if someone's only just slightly flexing their knees, then we'd get them to squat a little bit deeper. But generally we see about a 90-degree angle, but it's self-selected by the athlete.
We used to have a little trick going back many years. I don't think I've seen it mentioned on any ethics ever. But to overcome that little dip, what we used to do, get someone into the most dorsiflex position to try and restrict any further downward movement through the knees and ankles. And then we would put either a pen or a screwdriver directly under the chin, which was a deterrent from actually moving the head. But it's true. This is a true thing, but we don't mention it too much.
Yeah, not sure ACU's ethics board will allow that in there. Very cool. But
yeah, we could try machetes, I guess. But
yeah. Paul, you touched on just then the familiarization component, which I think in elite sport is, when we're trying to make decisions around possibly modifying training, like John said, or using it to better inform how guys are responding to training. When we're doing tests like CMJs and squat jumps to try and determine baselines and familiarization, how many tests do you really think guys need in order to do that? And also, we're probably in John and say for myself in our environment, we don't tend to be able to get athletes fresh either. So it may be that we get them at after a field session, possibly just before a strength session. So how do you try and mitigate those other factors?
Look, I think with simple tests like a counter movement jump, the familiarization doesn't need to be extensive, but what you need to understand is the error that you're picking up in the test. And I think this might have been touched on in one of your previous panels, but to understand the variation in the test from day to day for the athletes, to get some reliability information about it, is going to be really important to being able then to make decisions based on what a real change is in your information. So whether you're determining a smallest worthwhile change or looking at a coefficient of variation, understanding how much error is in that test inherently with your athletes. And that's really important, especially if they're coming in at different levels, and then having some sort of threshold or cutoff for when you think there's a big enough change in that. So it might be that you're getting consistent jumps within a few % of each other before a session or after a session. But then after 2 weeks of training, you're starting to see quite big deviations that are much bigger than the noise in the test for that particular athlete. So I think the fact that you can test these athletes consistently over a long period of time means you have a good data set on them to be able to see, well, what's the general noise in the test for an individual? And then you can determine when a large deviation occurs from that. But I think in terms of how they jump familiarization wise, you wouldn't need too many. With athletes in our studies, we use 2 sessions, and we'll probably have them do 4 or 5 of each of the jumps in those familiarization sessions before we're confident for repeat performance. But we always determine the reliability of those tests in our own lab and in our own conditions, as opposed to trying to look at reliability that's been published in a completely different environment. I think that's probably a key thing to keep in mind with these.
Yeah.
John.
Yeah, no, it's all really well said. We've more so in the past with East Tennessee State, we really tried to get baseline data on people. So we'd bring them back under two different sessions, so separated by 24, 48 hours, have them do 5 to 10 jumps, and then kind of through that establish some of their normal variation. Obviously now, in the environment I work in now, it's, as you mentioned, it's pretty challenging to get that information. So, because there's always practice, there's always context to every data point you collect, versus in the research setting, you can get pretty clean baselines. But now, like, we can lean on like change point statistics and things like that to just try to establish like what we deem as a deviation from normal. And that's really all that needs to happen from a fatigue management standpoint, or the like, is my program working standpoint, is how do you want to approach what normal is, and then what does different from normal mean? And so if you're kind of, whether you have the opportunity to collect a sterile baseline or not, like, you're still approaching really those 2 things with your data.
It's an interesting debate. Do you have anything else to add to that, Phil?
Yeah, I'd say that, when we're talking about familiarization, I'd also add that it's important looking at standing body weight calculations as part of that. If your body weight is out, it's going to throw your whole metrics out as well, in terms of, derived parameters. So when you're doing familiarization, it's important that you can get a very steady body weight, and the athletes are not distracted and moving their head around and chatting to people. They've got to be focused on, as soon as they stand on the plate, familiar starts at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting because for our athletes in Australian rules football, if you do a test following a big field session, you could have guys that are down 3 kilos in body weight because of the hard training session. So that's something we've definitely had to take into consideration if we have the ability to test on a non-field day, look at getting some baseline almost in a somewhat fresher state, but then also do the same testing following a field session, and almost kind of get a spectrum where, I wouldn't say it's a fresh test versus a fatigue test, but it may give you a little bit more of a guideline of what their normal variation is. And then once we determine the smallest worthwhile change and the coefficient of variation of the test, then we can assess that based on the individual's variance and try and gauge that. And that's been, we don't currently do any daily jumps, but we do kind of have jumps and our performance assessments every 3 to 5 weeks within our program. So we're not necessarily using it per se like you might be, John, in regards to impacting decisions on the day. We're more so looking at how our strength and power program is having an effect on their profile, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So the follow on for that, outside of some of the jumps for assessing readiness, we have the other component of using ForcePlates, and that's to assess lower body maximal strength or lower limb strength, whether it's via isometric assessment, and even more recently some of the upper body strength isometric assessments using the ASH test or the IYT test to assess. How have you guys seen the impact of using some of those upper and lower limb unilateral tests within your athletes, John? Have you used the IYT previously?
I actually have not. Know some colleagues that have, especially ones that work in baseball. But our single limb isometric assessment has been in the hamstring. So we did a unilateral bridge assessment, and kind of our entire staff helped develop it. Austin Driggers, Jared Abel, everybody else that was at our complex. So it's by no means something that I did, and also we leaned heavily on Craig Turner because he had done something similar at NC State with their soccer guys. But essentially what we wanted to represent was, or to better represent, I guess, was the hamstring strength at a knee angle that was relevant to sprinting. We kind of leaned on the little evidence that exists there that it's pretty likely that our hamstring strains are going to occur in late swing or early stance phase, and so about what knee angle does that occur, and we essentially put them in that and then had them do a unilateral bridge assessment.
Long lever?
Yep, long lever. Yep, about we put it at about 20 degrees of knee flexion, about 20 degrees.
Yeah, we've done something similar, and I think the research says, between 15 and 30 degrees will be your max kind of biceps femoris activation. And how have you found that in regards to as an assessment of, I'm assuming you're doing that more assessment of kind of minimal thresholds to just assess whether guys are strong enough as a protective component? Yep.
And I'm careful, just in general, not just with this assessment, to draw like hard lines and call them thresholds. So at least the way I conceptualize it is more of a confidence meter that this isn't a very highly contributing risk factor. So we don't have like a magic threshold or anything like that, but we obviously have risk profiles that we develop with this and some other things. And this is certainly an important piece to that. And it allows us to, not only to identify those athletes that are maybe at a greater risk of experiencing hamstring injury, but also it's really important that whatever program we are doing to intervene with those that are at risk, that we are actually doing something to mitigate that a bit. And so we use it not only to identify those people, but also to kind of hold our program accountable to limiting that for them.
Yeah. Paul or Phil, have you used that test at all, the unilateral long lever assessment?
Go on, Paul.
There's been a few trials with using some of that stuff and trying to develop, I guess, some validity and reliability to some of those tests at ACU, but I'd say that's probably early phase at the moment. So seen the test, but not used it extensively. I'd say that we've probably used the isometric mid-thigh pull really extensively in our testing. So I can touch on that later if you wanted to just have a chat about some of the long lever unilateral stuff. Yep. Phil?
Yeah, we've tried long and short lever with hip and knee at 90, extended leg with a few of the athletes. But I think from the injury prevention point of view, particularly with sprinters, jumpers, we've tended to use the node board, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And we would always see that as a first step to go into a deeper level, maybe looking at isokinetics, biodecks, SciDecks type measurements as well as an additional form of analysis.
Yeah.
We have Nordboard as well. We kind of paired those two things together. It's absolutely. And that's what if Simmons and that group, if that's what they are recommending, then that's that's obviously something we're very, very interested in too.
In regards to just more so from a numbers perspective, John, I know in our athlete cohort, like the weaker guys in that test, I've tended to see kind of in the, I guess, 200 Newton component versus the stronger guys being between the 400 to 500 Newton. Have you seen similar numbers with your guys?
Yeah, that's about right. And, we have a lot of diversity in our game too, which is a great thing. And from a physical performance and development standpoint, does present some unique challenges because we have players that are obviously very young and are 16, 17 years old on up to veterans in the game at the major league level. And so we've just, that's why too, I don't necessarily like thresholds because it's not necessarily a level playing field depending on how you're evaluating that athlete. And so we do have to kind of create some buckets in that regard and how we put some of that data together as well.
Yeah. It's also, like Phil touched on, we use Nordboard a lot to kind of assess whether our guys have the tissue resilience to withstand what the game of AFL puts on them. But I've used the ISO test with athletes previously who have possibly reported some form of weakness or soreness following a session, and we're not necessarily wanting to throw them on a Nordboard prior to a main strength session or leading into a game. So have used the isometric assessment to build almost that confidence level within the athlete, but also to give us some data on possibly how much force they're able to generate limb to limb, and use it as an educational format for the athlete. But we don't have baseline data on all of our athletes, so we need to also understand that it could bite us in the backside. But for the couple of athletes that we have done it with, it actually showed that the limb that they were feeling some symptoms on was stronger than the unaffected limb. So then when they go out to the field, they have somewhat more confidence that the strength is there, and possibly, once we start to talk to them about the complex nature of the nervous system and central sensitization and other factors, then their willingness to want to train and or try and run quick is better. So that's another kind of component of, I guess, the ability to use that assessment while not necessarily having the numbers per se around exact raw data on what the smallest worthwhile change or coefficient of variation is. It can just be a tool to build athlete confidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you brought up a really good point there too, and a way that the isometric long lever test has helped us out a great deal is in those situations where the Nordic isn't necessarily an option. And I'm referring more to an injury. So we can even assess players when they do get injured sooner, and have a better idea of where they are at in return to play. Now, obviously, when we get to those late stages, they do need to demonstrate that they have the eccentric knee flexor strength and that they can perform all of those things. But as we guide early stages, especially, it's extremely helpful that we have that test as well to look at their baseline data and see just how far along they are relative to that.
I touched on an interesting one because, Phil, have you had many jumpers that are unable to perform Nordics because of posterior lateral knee pain? I know I've spoken to guys who have worked in the Chinese Olympic squads and stuff who they get this posterior lateral knee pain from performing it, whether or not it's because of, tendon irritation or other components? Have you seen that where?
Yeah, we got to be careful working with the younger lads, particularly with issues around osgood-Schlatter's, patella tendon pain and all those types of things. So we don't do it too often. We tend to monitor strength maybe every 5 or 6 weeks as part of a battery of testing. So we will do strength training, maybe 2-3 times a week, depending on what phase of the year it's in. But we've got to protect the knees as well. We're very conscious about that.
Yeah, definitely. And Paul, you touched on before the isometric mid-thigh pull, and I guess it's another component of ForcePlate testing is the ability to test lower body maximal strength, and how you kind of use that to assess athletes.
Yeah, I mean, it often comes up with us when we're doing a full load velocity profile. So we might use it as part of like an unweighted test, some loaded counter movement jumps, and then we'll have a max force isometric test and even some drop jumps or something along those lines. But I think it's just one of those tests that has a lot of utility because of the relative simplicity of setting it up, getting a maximal performance out of people who might not be competent in performing a max squat or a max deadlift. But then giving us some good feedback and good information for training. So we use it in research projects to profile our athletes, and we tend to show that those that are stronger in tests like that seem to get smaller magnitude increases in some of the damage markers that we might look at post simulation. So that tends to be an interesting finding that comes up repeatedly in some of our research projects. But we also use it when we do some consulting and we test athletes at the university and see that, some of the better athletes tend to be stronger, and whether that just be a greater training age or it's a key quality for performance of their sport. But again, just the simplicity and utility of it and relative safety of it as a test seems to be quite a good fit for a lot of the stuff that we do. Like we use it in clinical populations as well at ACU with the exercise physiology that we have there. Female team sports that come in and test with us, we tend to throw the test at everyone and get some really good info.
And outside of, I guess, the main metrics of just peak force, have you found the force at different time points, or, I know people talk about rate of force development at different time points, but maybe there's too much variability within that? What about those other metrics?
Yeah, they tend to be challenging. So even under research conditions where we we standardize things as much as possible in terms of position, in terms of pre-tension with the activity and so on, some of the rate of force development metrics tend to still have a fair bit of noise in them. So we can look at different epochs within the test. So maybe from 100 to 200 milliseconds might give us some more reliable or tighter data. But to be honest, we haven't leaned on it in too great a detail. So Phil might know those metrics a bit better and may have used them a bit more extensively. But in our practice, we tend to look at relative peak force production and peak force production absolute. And when we're using that particular test with most of the populations we look at, that's often one of the key things we want to assess anyway.
Yep. Phil, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'm not. I don't do mid-thigh pull. I tend to go for the ice squat. I remember many years ago, we moved our support to the British jump squad from the university to a high performance centre, and we couldn't take a Biodex or a Lido or whatever isokinetic machine we had there. So we came up with a new strength test, and this must have been around the turn of the century. And we came up with trying to get the athlete in a position that replicated the isometric part of a jump. So the knee angle being around 135, 140 degrees, the body being upright, the hip and the ankle in vertical alignment all the way through, ankle, hip, shoulder all in a line. And we just couldn't get the athletes. You got really tall athletes, some fairly short. You just couldn't get them in the same position. So we opted for the ISO squat. The advantage of that one for me was that it's a push. It's not got any leakage through joint laxities through the wrist, elbow, shoulders, whatever. You know, it was a push. It took the arm movements out of it and the pull phase. It also helps you to avoid sudden impacts. So we're talking about RFDs. One of the big dangers, I guess, of looking at RFD is whether you're looking at an impact-induced rise in force or an active pull. And I've seen many videos of people doing ISO pulls, ISO squats as well, where they've dropped and smashed the bar, either pulling up or jamming on the neck. One thing about doing an ISO squat, they only do that once because it hurts. But as I said, you know, if you get a massive spike in the force graph and then a drop, you know it's an impact related force, and it's not an active RFD. So it's a nonsense really. So making sure you've got some element of pre-tension and there is no sudden impact, I think you can get some reasonable RFDs. Just touching on what Paul said there, different metrics. We tended initially to just go with an average RFD, be it 100, 150 or 200 milliseconds. And the rationale behind that was essentially different contact phases in a triple jump. You know, 100, 120 milliseconds is a hop, 150 is about a step, 180, 200 is a jump. So we just settled for looking at 150, an RFD over 150. That was the choice of RFD that I chose. Nowadays, I've sort of shifted away from a lot of RFDs, even within counter movement jumps or whatever. I would just go for, in the ISO squat, would just go for the peak force. I don't care how long it takes to get there. I just want to know how strong they are against that fixed bar.
And Phil, would you even recommend like doing even like a gradual buildup? So if you're throwing out any you know, kind of concern for RFD and you want to limit that impact artifact with that force spike, do you recommend doing a gradual build there?
I don't pay too much attention to it, to be honest. The instructions are, you will find that if they're not confident, they will do a gradual build up anyway. But what we say is there's a little bit of give in our bar. We've got our own rack with little hooks over the top, which is one of the best ISO squat rigs I've ever used, you know. What we tend to do is get them to put a little bit of tension in so you can hear a little click, and they apply a little bit of baseline force, and then we get them to push as hard as they can. We avoid a lot of the impacts, but we get them to push for 5 seconds and then stop, and then it's just the peak force over that 5.
So you just don't give them, you let them self-select?
Well, what you find is in the first couple of times that they go on the ISO squat, they're a little bit apprehensive because it is a little bit of uncomfortable on the shoulders. We do allow them to put the plastic cuff there to spread the load a little bit. We get them to bring the arms in, get the traps up, avoid it resting on the vertebra. And after a couple of times, you know, they're fairly consistent and reliable in how they perform that. And to date, there's been no back injury or anything. We're really strict on the back being vertical and the hips being directly below the bar. So we're very, very tight on that.
And Phil, with how long you've been using that test for, what have you found as being I guess, the peak force of really good performers in that test versus poor performers? What sort of numbers are you seeing with that?
The highest score, absolute score, we've had over 7,000 newtons with one of our throwers, who's just over 100 kilos. We've had a few over 6,000. But with the jumpers, obviously it's not about the absolute strength, it's about the relative strength. And over the years, having tested the UK senior squads back in the early 2000s to testing these lads at Aspire, we're looking at something between 6.5 to 7 body weights as a peak force. And they're the ones who are going on to compete at World Junior Championships. Yeah. So it's pretty phenomenal, really.
Yeah, Paul, with the ISO mid-fire stuff you talked about with being relatively stronger, what sort of numbers are you seeing typically in more your athletic population that determines them being strong?
I think we've seen anywhere from, we've had some elite track sprint cyclists there, we've had some amateur weightlifters on there. The track sprint guys probably in the 60 newtons per kilo range, so probably similar to what Phil's saying about six or so times body mass for that. Then some of our team sport athletes, I think the stronger ones are probably in the 40 newton per kilo ballpark, and some of the less strong ones probably in the low 30. But we, as an example, we do a bit of consulting work with some emergency services and some of the high level emergency services that we look at, more specialized jobs. We actually use a mid-thigh pull test with some of them as a test of their absolute strength, essentially, and lower body strength. And we probably set the bar for that around the mid 30 newtons per kilo as a baseline for some of the more specialized operators in some of those emergency services.
Yep. Yeah, nice. We have a question from one of the attendees. So when looking at specific metrics from the CMJ, would it be simplistic to try and relate these measures to physical qualities you observe in outdoor performance? So I think probably what they're talking about is metrics around, say, eccentric deceleration and whether it has any correlation to change of direction or deceleration ability on the field, or concentric force output and possibly acceleration capability. And happy to throw to any of you guys possibly on what input you have for that.
We did correlations many years ago between counter movement and squat jump power against 20 and 40 meter sprint times. There was a decent relationship between them. I've not looked at anything in relation to looking at eccentric RFDs or peak eccentric velocity in a counter movement with changing direction or deceleration ability. I think you're looking at two different things there. We had I've always been privileged to have embedded force plates within our labs, be it back in the university setting or Aspire. So we can measure deceleration forces directly anyway. So that would be my preferred option. If I'm looking at deceleration, we could measure, I'd rather do it in a deceleration test. And we developed a protocol actually using the LAVEG, the laser gun, where we did start-stop acceleration, decelerations over known distances and built a deceleration gradient from that. But we also captured forces in the embedded plates that we have there as well. If I was looking at any, if I didn't have access to that facility or resource, I'd be looking more at maybe a single leg hop and hold or a single leg drop jump. you know, something where there is a higher level of eccentric loading. I think that would be my advice.
John, you mentioned before around acceleration being important in, you know, stealing bases or running between bases. And is there anything that you guys look at from a performance metric to help determine which guys have the qualities to perform better out on the field?
From a sprinting standpoint?
Yeah.
You know, I'm pretty careful I mean, that's kind of why you do your counter movement jump assessments to an extent, is to get this, you know, general idea of lower body power. And if they don't have any of that, if they don't meet that prerequisite, then you've got to provide them that through training. But there's plenty of fast people because they're such skilled sprinters. So speaking like specifically to sprinting, and I will admit my bias, having been schooled by Dr. Brad DeWeese, that he's the ultimate like sprinting is a skill person. So I guess I'm careful to make very like direct, like, oh, they don't have this, so then we need to give it to them in order for them to sprint. However, athletes are going to self-select a certain technique based on what they are capable of physically. And so whenever that is the case, and we you know, lean on not only our ForcePlate data, but also our anthropometric data and things like that, we can begin to piece together, like, is this guy strong enough to get better at sprinting, or do we need to kind of address one of these prerequisites? So we don't necessarily have a certain variable that we would lean on for that. I think jump height, actually, to Phil's earlier point, would be a great one, and kind of use that to be our proxy for their lower body capabilities.
Yep, definitely. Paul, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that? Otherwise, I'm going to...
No, I mean, there's always some relationships, but whether they're causative and whether that's the only factor in having that performance or not is probably another question. So, yeah, peak power relative to body mass might be related to acceleration, but there might be other factors involved in that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when it comes to change of direction, the component that you're not assessing in those movements is the chaotic nature of field-based sports, and the decision-making component to determining how much space you have between you and another athlete, or the dimensions of your field. So whether you can find a metric that actually correlates, but then also you tend to, within your squads, to have such small numbers, so the ability to draw really positive correlations is also statistically quite tough.
Yeah, it's really like you can be in a really dangerous spot of creating narratives when you go from like, they need a certain jump height or peak power per kilo in order to run, versus saying, okay, well, this athlete has a running problem. Like they need to run faster, or they can't, you know, execute the mechanics that we're trying to teach them. Then go back to your force platform data and dive into the weeds there to see if there is anything you can elucidate that might be contributing to them not being able to to sprint the way that they are capable of. Right. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg, or a semantic situation a bit, but I think it's a pretty important one, especially like the bias of our lens being on like the physical development side, that we want to lean on things that like peak power and jump height and things like that, and create maybe a narrative that isn't true. So I tend to try my best to like wait for not that you're always being reactive to a performance problem, but generally that's a little bit more successful whenever we have those situations.
Definitely. And so we had a question around the reactive strength component, and I guess measuring or trying to measure elastic qualities in an athlete is an interesting discussion. There's the drop jumps components to build out their profile. And then more recently, people have been looking at the 10-5 reactive jump and taking the best 5 performances of that as either an average of those 10 and trying to determine, I guess, reactive strength qualities. Have you guys looked at any of those assessments away from just the standard drop jump? Phil, with jumpers that you've worked with, have you still just stayed with drop jump as your primary means for assessing that?
Yeah, a couple of reasons, I guess. One is that we've got normative data from jumpers around Asia, from a lot of the countries around Asia that visited Aspire. They went through the same battery of tests that we did back in the UK with our senior athletes there. So we've got a nice database that we use for, you know, grading the qualities of our athletes against them. I think because I'm trying to think, because jumping is essentially one big effort, you know, take the approach out of it, I guess. Jumping is one big effort. You know, I try and keep it clean. I'm using the drop jump for a specific purpose. I want to see how they respond to an impact and get out of it, you know, in terms of the jump height, you know, the RSI. I do 3 of them. I do 3 counter movement jumps, and that is my jump test done. We then go on to do standing long jump into a pit, 5 bounds, 5 hops left and right. So we're building in a whole jump battery that is vertical, which is more controlled, more diagnostic, and then a little bit more field-based, where they're applying those qualities into something, I hate this word, more functional, you know, more specific to what they're going on to do in performance. So the 40-meter sprint test, the iso squat, counter movement, drop jump from 40 centimeters, standing long jump, 5 bounds into a pit. We just measure the distance there, and 5 hops left and right, finishing off with a proper landing. That is our protocol, and what we assess every, as I say, 4, 5, 6 weeks. We also tie in with some biodex testing 2 or 3 times a year, and we do the UTC scanning of tendons, just to see how the health of the tendons are. You know, that is essentially our physical profiling of jumpers.
Yeah. Paul or John, have you used any other strategies to assess RSI, or you both like the drop jump as the main protocol for that?
Yeah, we've used drop jumps, with the calculating the reactive strength index from those tends to be the best way to assess reactive strength. Yeah.
I mean, we've tried it. Some of the guys, James Baker is trying the 10-5. You know, we joke about it. You know, I'll say, is it the 13-2 this week? You know, every so often we get a different combination of, you know, going to do 10, we're going to do 11, whatever. You know, I think it's great that people are using and exploring ForcePlates. I would say I would never look at asymmetries from a 10-5. I think you're wasting your time there, because there's too much movement around the plate, and you tend to need a bigger area with young kids. I don't know what it's like with older guys, but for that test, I would avoid looking at any asymmetries. I wouldn't have a problem with the drop jump.
Lights either. We played around with the 10-5 this year in pre-season to see what our squad familiarisation was like, and it took, I think, a minimum of 6 familiarisation sessions for guys to actually but have some good numbers around the test. And even then, our coefficient of variation was still 13%. And that's with 6 tests in an AFL population. But I think the data is there from drop jumps, and it's, some of the great work that Jeremy Shepherd has done, and I know Tim Pillow's done some stuff in volleyball as well. So I think you're correct, Phil, in that regard. John, we've had 2 people direct some questions.
Correct.
Yeah, who, Jez or Tim or Phil? They're all great practitioners. John, we've had 2 questions directed to you, just more so in relationship to isometric mid-thigh pull, and if you're currently using that, and whether you've found any relationship with throwing or hitting performance in your athlete population.
No, we are not using the mid-thigh pull in my current role. I did work with baseball during my doctoral work, and we did the mid-thigh pull there with baseball athletes. And the only thing I'll add, and you could probably even guess what direction I'm going to go if you've seen the webinar, but swinging a bat and throwing a ball are really skill intensive. There's not necessarily the physical characteristics do not matter. They certainly do. But they are so skill dominant that I think it's really tough to see any signal into hitting or pitching, because you also have whenever you're trying to tie it directly to a performance on the field or anything like that, you obviously have a lot of an overwhelming amount of tactical interference happening there too. So certainly interesting, certainly somewhat logical, but the last thing, I guess the last piece I'll add to that, I think you will see those relationships be greater at lower levels of play, because you to a degree take away some of that skill bias, the people that make it to be able to play for us or any other organization. They are, oh my goodness, are they skilled? And that's not to take away from anybody at the college level or the high school level or anything like that. But I think you would see more, and this is just an opinion, but I think you would see more high performers that also in the isometric mid-thigh pull or isometric squat that also tended to be pretty good hitters, because the physical characteristics are what, to an extent, are differentiating them from the competition, versus at the highest level, it is a skill competition, essentially. So no, my very long-winded answer to that one is we haven't been able to really tease that one apart as clean as you might think.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point in regards to the skill component involved in those performances and just how complex it can be. And a follow-up was, so Phil just gave us a really good rundown of some of his battery of testing. We've had a question just around some of the risk mitigation testing that you spoke about with using the ISO long lever assessment and some Nordboard. What other, tools are you using at the moment to help build out your profile with your athletes?
Yeah, it's obviously the Nordboard and the single leg ISO bridge are 2 really important pieces. And we've also got a really great medical staff that gives us a very thorough ortho eval. And some of the pieces from that we've been able to kind of internally tease apart as being important for this type of stuff. Unfortunately, I especially with all I'm partly kidding with all the baseball folks on here, I can't share the specific details, but the short version of it is it's a combination of measurements that we collect with the Nordboard and with the ISO squad, and then also some measurements that are more orthopedic in nature that we've been able to identify as part of that risk profile.
Yep. No, fair enough. Got to keep some competitive edge, mate.
I'm sorry, it's just it's the nature.
That's fine. Paul, you are obviously involved in testing a number of different populations. You're testing battery. Does it change a lot depending on who comes through, or do you kind of have some stables and then you manipulate it based on the people coming through ACU?
It definitely does change depending on the sports, because some sports have different characteristics that we might want to flesh out. So looking at like a track sprint cyclist, then the power output's really important, but also being able to produce that power quickly under some external load. So we lean potentially more on some loaded jumping performance there and some peak force metrics. Stu Cormack is involved with some combat athletes at the moment, and some of those are fencers who have some pretty rapid eccentric components to their attacks in their sport. So we tend to use some reactive strength testing with them, some drop jump testing with them as well. So it tends to vary a little bit. In the lab, any type of testing or analysis we do, we'd probably throw a squat jump, a counter movement jump, and a mid-thigh pull at them to try and get a bit more of a broad scope of some concentric only power outputs, some counter movement jumps, an elastic component, and then a maximal strength output as well, which tends to be, that's a pretty quick protocol for us to run with familiarized athletes. We tend to be able to flesh out a whole heap of information for them too. But then there's also all the biodecks, the isokinetic testing, any Nordic testing that might be involved in that as well. Like that all exists in our tests as well, for sure.
With your drop jump assessments, are you using a fixed height, or are you doing 3 different heights for your assessment?
Yeah, generally we'd look at a 40 and a 60 for those. So usually use both tests for those.
Yep.
I think it's probably worth mentioning that Drew and myself have been discussing a new test to implement into the system, which will give you your counter movement and drop jump at the same time. So, rather than doing 10-5, you do a maximal counter movement jump, land, and do a drop jump. So you get your maximal concentric power, you get your RSI, you get your drop jump power at the same time, all relative to your maximum jump height, I guess, rather than, you could say, do you go from 40, 60, 30, whatever. But I think the variability in drop height anyway, when you do a step off, do you jump off? Is it single leg, one floating out? I think there's a lot of variability in drop height. In many ways, you want a trap door that just, like a cartoon character running off a cliff. That's the ideal scenario. But, I think if we can try and develop this option where we have a countered followed by a drop jump, then I think it could speed up your processes even more. Mm-hmm. So that is something in the pipeline.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, I guess then what you need to be able to keep an eye on is the athlete's effort to get that initial jump height, to try and maintain that within a certain window, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing is, if you're going to do it 3 times, you could build it up. You could do a sub-maximal jump, and grade it up to a maximal jump. So you can build up a profile of what your RSI is relative to a known drop height. So, I mean, again, maybe it's my turn. I'm the creative one now, but I'm sure I'm not the only person who's thought of that. But
I think one of the things that we've started to play around with a little bit more recently is looking at stiffness and getting some vertical stiffness from the force plates and leg stiffness from those. Phil, I wonder if you could touch on them briefly for us and how the force plates are giving us that information from various tests.
Yeah, the stiffness one is a fascinating variable, isn't it? I'd never even thought about doing stiffness in a counter movement jump, to be honest, ever. And we had a request for that a few years ago, which we incorporated into the system. It's a lot cleaner in a counter movement jump, for sure, because it's your peak force divided by your maximum displacement, So when you land, we're assuming that is your zero, and anything from your contact point, the displacement from that point down to its maximum is your depth of movement. So it's your peak force divided by your depth. Now, if you think about a drop jump, there are two types of drop jump. You can get one that's a very stiff contact with an impact force followed by a trough and a drive off. Sometimes your impact force is greater than your drive off force. Which one do you take on that? Do you take your peak one if it's an impact, or do you take your peak one if it's a drive off? What we try to do is rename them as a passive stiffness, which was the impact force divided by your displacement, and an active stiffness, which is essentially your concentric force, peak force divided by displacement. Now,
are you talking about landing displacement or takeoff displacement there?
Landing. So the change in height of your center of mass from contact to its minimum, roughly halfway through the contact phase. That becomes a little bit more awkward when you've got your inverted U type of contact, which you see quite a lot in very trained jumpers with good elastic qualities. If you've got your rugby players, you're pretty sure it's going to have a heavy impact, a trough and a drive off. I think the way we should be going is extracting in a pure Hooke's law scenario, take the force at the corresponding depth of displacement. So force at zero velocity divided by displacement. I think that is probably a better way to express stiffness, personally.
So Phil obviously touched on drop jump as that mode of assessment. How are you guys been looking at it, Paul? Have you been using drop jump to determine that or to assess it?
So I guess there's a couple of potential options. So just a standard counter movement jump or repeat counter movement jumps is probably the most common way that we've tended to look at it. I don't think we've actually looked at it from a drop jump perspective, to be honest, mainly just from the jumps themselves.
Yeah. And what are you guys seeing in regards to that, like within the kind of the populations you've been testing? Is it a sensitive metric?
So it's probably even more preliminary than that for us, but we'll probably look to see if it is sensitive. So that's probably where the research will move to in our space, to see whether or not that might give us a sensitive measure or give us some information about changes in that following maybe a fatiguing protocol or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's an
interesting one there, Paul, because I mean, if you took, rather than your peak concentric force, if you just took the alignment of force at zero velocity divided by displacement, it's all lined up. And that stiffness measurement then is a real composite then of what you've done in your eccentric phase in terms of the depth of movement, and also in relation to how much force you're building up in the tissues in that eccentric phase. So, I mean, now I think about it, maybe that stiffness in the counter movement is a decent measurement, and it avoids. I'd be keen to see how it relates to eccentric RFD, for example. Yeah, I think they would probably be very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Yeah, because it's interesting when you talk about people using the term stiffness out on the field and coach's eye and his inability to apply force through the ground or be stiff upon impact, whether it's to do with change of direction or jumping and those qualities. So it's commonly something that's conversed in coaching term out on the field, but being able to actually measure it and then determine what differentiates between a good performer versus a bad performer is I guess the next phase. So could be some interesting research coming from you guys at ACU. Paul, we have another question just going back in regards to the ISO test. So in relation to unilateral versus bilateral. So if you have the total force output of 4,000 newtons bilateral, but 2,500 unilateral, how's that best to interpret the data, or is assessing unilaterally in either the ISO squat or the ISO mid-thigh pull? Is it because of, I guess, the unilateral nature, do you lose some of the sensitivity of the test? Paul, have you?
I think that's a good example of a bilateral deficit there, like those kind of testing results where we tend to sum the unilateral data and see greater summative force with unilateral tests than the bilateral one. So that's probably not an uncommon test result. In terms of whether I've used many of the unilateral ones, I haven't used too many unilateral tests as opposed to using the ForceDecks now, where I can get some unilateral left and right limb data from the same test. I think for us that's probably a bit more time efficient and might have some more utility.
Have you found assessing asymmetry and ISO mid-thigh pull valuable? I tried to look at it within our playing cohort, and there wasn't anything that stood out massively, but I was probably more so looking at retrospectively at guys who had previous, say, knee or lower limb injuries that had missed large portions of time to see if there was any deficiency there.
I think it definitely came up when we started looking at some tennis players and looking at some differences in their mid-thigh pull performance between limbs. So not related to any previous injury, but it's one of those things where you're not really sure if that's conducive to being good at the sport because they load one leg differently when they're hitting a shot more commonly, or whether that's something that you'd look at to potentially try and modify based on their performance. I mean, when we looked at some weightlifters, if they had a huge discrepancy between limbs, then we'd probably question why that's the case, because they should be performing pretty consistently through both sides, through both of their limbs. But in some of those other sports that are more dynamic, I guess it's difficult to ascertain whether that's because of the sport or that's one of the things that makes them good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Feel with your jumpers and I guess possibly needing to be able to distribute force limb to limb well. Have you used the unilateral assessments at all?
We've played around with it now and again, but I think it's more of a time issue. We can get left and right forces using the ForceDecks. We do see asymmetries there doing the bilateral ISO squat. One positive of doing single leg would be that there's less force going through the spine, I guess. So it's a trade-off really between risk and time in testing, but the double leg seems to give us enough from we can pick up asymmetries there for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
John, did you have anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of share the sentiments of Phil and Paul there that have definitely leaned more heavily when doing like global max strength assessments, like doing a bilateral test. And I would also agree with Paul that like the sport tends to, at least like qualitatively observing, seems to impact how frequent asymmetries appear. And I think it impacts our interpretation of it. Quite a few of our pitchers at East Tennessee State presented a lot more strength on their dominant side because they spend most of their time pushing really aggressively off of a mound, so you can pretty quickly arrive at a logical reason why that may be. But as Paul alluded to, like, maybe that's not such a bad thing, because that's exactly what they need to be capable of doing. So not to say that lead leg doesn't need to be strong as well, in order to effectively block and allow some transfer of momentum over the front side, but it fits pretty neatly that that drive leg was higher. So, and again, we got that doing a bilateral test that we didn't need to add any further unilateral assessments. It was pretty clean.
I think one of the risks of doing single leg is what do you do with the leg that is not pushing? Any swinging movement in that free leg is going to affect your force trace. Mm-hmm. If you put it on a bench behind, are you actually losing force by the foot pressing down into the bench? So I think you've got to be more strict in your protocols there to make sure that non-pushing leg is fixed, but not applying force elsewhere.
Yeah, I've used the bilateral assessments as the performance assessment, but then some unilateral almost training protocols in guys who can't jump because either they're load compromised, whether that's joint issues or tendon issues, and use the ISO squat similar to some of Alex Natera's work at using it as an actual training protocol within their strength program, and found basically that it was able to address some of the asymmetry that we saw in the bilateral assessment, and also athletes who couldn't jump actually improved their jump height with doing that training protocol without jumping at all. So, there's also the component of, do you need to use it as a test versus a training tool? And once again, probably comes back to Paul's point around it depends with the athlete who's in front of you and what best suits your time restraints. So we've had another question, which I know was one posted on social media platforms a couple of weeks ago, around if there's any info comparing spinal loads between isometric mid-thigh pull and the ISO squat. Phil, I don't know if you have any insight into this. I'm unsure of if there's any data, or Paul, if you know anything.
I haven't seen any published data personally, so I'm not too sure about that one. Sorry.
I haven't seen any published data, but I've done each test quite a few times, and
sure.
I have a guess.
Yeah. What do you personally feel from your spine, John?
I mean, the ISO squat's a tough test. However, I think that it has a lot of benefits in terms of testing safety that maybe the isometric mid-thigh pull does not have. But in terms of just like the forces experienced by a spine, I'd probably give the edge to the ISO squat if I were a betting man. But definitely, I did the isometric squat for my dissertation, so I really like the assessment and think there's a lot of things that make it extremely safe. But that piece, I'd probably give the edge there.
I just think you've got to be very strict. Mm-hmm. You know, when the instructions are to really control your core, and as soon as you see the hip moving forward or backwards, you terminate the test. And reinforce stability is key. And based on that, and not having a jarring through a little counter movement, you know, as I said, there's been mild discomfort, but that eases off in minutes. You know, it's nothing that I've experienced as being serious.
I don't mean to paint it as something that's overwhelming or a reason that you should or should not do the assessment, but I've more people like just in putting people through the assessment, and Phil, I'm not nearly as experienced as you, but more people like tend to want to wear a belt. And some of that may be just to like feel that stability in that test versus a mid-thigh pull. But some of that could be just a nice cue for them to be as braced as they should be, rather than providing anything that's.
Yeah, I think it probably comes back to the protocol that you apply in any form of testing, whether it's isometric testing, drop jump testing. It's as long as you have a protocol that you have set up to follow each time, the risk being placed on the athletes is going to be minimal, and that is very much dependent on practitioner and the environment involved. We've got one last question probably before we wrap up from Justin. How much have we found is a healthy or performance difference in asymmetries for those unilateral based sports, that asymmetries are more performance indicators rather than injury risk indicators? So, you know, I guess we're talking kind of sometimes with injury, we can talk about asymmetries that may be not advantageous, but here Justin's more so talking about the benefits of possibly some asymmetries in unilateral sports.
I probably haven't seen enough data, to be honest, so it's more casual observations as opposed to hard and fast data to suggest, you know, having that kind of asymmetry is potentially beneficial to the sport. So I probably couldn't answer it scientifically or with any great confidence.
We did some
I
work.
did that with the squat.
Sorry, John, I interrupted you there.
Go ahead.
We did some work a number of years ago looking at sport-specific asymmetries in jumps, counter-movement jump, across football, rugby, athletics, cricket. And there was some slight differences between sports. The one thing that always stuck in my mind when we tested isokinetics with footballers was that you got stronger eccentric quads on the plant leg and stronger concentric quads on the kicking leg. Now, for sure, that is a performance benefit, for sure. You know, you repeat that movement and you adapt and you develop those specific differences. What I would suggest that you do for any given sport when you're doing your testing is you determine what is the typical absolute difference between two limbs. You know, if you're doing single leg tests or double leg tests, what is the typical or the mean absolute difference? And then add the standard deviation to that value and get a threshold. You know, if it's above that threshold, then I would say they're more likely to be asymmetrical for that sport, you know. And I think, you know, when we talk about asymmetry in general terms, you know, I always remember a conversation with a doctor at one of the rugby clubs. He always said, you never get a perfect specimen. It's the degree of damage that you inherit from them. So you're never going to get 100% specimen left and right. Exposure to a sport for sure is going to create some asymmetry. If you're playing squash and you're planting one leg in front of you constantly, you're going to get the same adaptation. I think where the problem comes is when that difference becomes too high, and when you're a bit older as well. You know, where your muscles are not as subtle, your tendons are a little bit stiffer. I'd say that's when you're going to be more cautious. So identify a typical threshold, look at the mean absolute difference between two limbs, add the standard deviation, create a threshold, and then say if it's above that, then you're more likely to be asymmetrical. If you're beneath that, don't worry, keep an eye on it. That would be my advice.
No, I think very good advice. Well, we might wrap it up there, guys. Really appreciate your time and the amount of information you've been able to provide everyone around this topic. I think everyone who's been involved will find it really valuable, and the link to this is available via the Valve web, so it won't be put up in public forums, but people who have registered for the event can watch it retrospectively. So there may be some follow-up questions which we can reach out to you guys individually, but really appreciate your time. And Phil, thanks for spending the night with us, mate. I hope you get some rest. Paul and John, enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, guys. Thanks to you.
Thank you guys very much.
See you later.
Yeah.
Right.
Good seeing everybody.
Ciao.